Now listen up, because this is a story about what happens when arrogance meets the quiet truth, and how sometimes the biggest bullies are taken down by the people they never even bothered to look at. Our main man in the hot seat was Bob Nelson. Bob was the kind of CEO who didn't just walk into a room, he marched in, trailing spotlights and noise. He built Nelson Dynamics from nothing, and he never let anyone forget it. He was a self-made titan, a big shot known throughout the state for his sharp suits, his louder-than-necessary laugh, and his terrible, terrible habit of humiliating employees in public. Bob's favorite target? The accounting team. He called them the pencil pushers, the bean counters, the folks who were easily replaced by a good piece of software. To Bob, they weren't professionals, they were necessary nuisances, constantly messing up his beautiful, money-making machine. The setting for this particular showdown was the quarterly results meeting. It wasn't held in a cozy conference room. Oh no, Bob liked the spectacle. It was held in the company auditorium, a cavernous, cold place built for shareholder presentations and company rallies. Today, it was packed. Managers, auditors flown in from out of state, and maybe 20 junior staff members squeezed into the back rows, hoping to become invisible. The air in that auditorium was thick with dread. It wasn't the kind of professional tension you get before a major presentation. It was the kind you feel right before a storm hits, and you know you're standing in an open field. The accounting team was seated front and center, looking like a flock of nervous pigeons. They were neat, quiet, and absolutely terrified of what Bob was about to do to them.
Among them sat Mark. Mark was the definition of a junior accountant. He was young, maybe 25, with glasses that were perpetually slipping down his nose and a tie knot that looked just a little too tight. Mark was meticulous. He loved numbers the way a gardener loves soil. He understood the need for everything to be organized and accounted for. But Mark was also cripplingly shy. He was the kind of guy who practiced ordering coffee in the mirror just to make sure he didn't stumble over his words. His obedience was legendary. He would do anything he was asked, provided he didn't have to talk to anyone important. Right now, Mark was sweating. He was clutching a cheap ballpoint pen so tightly his knuckles were white. He knew the drill. Bob would spend the first hour praising himself, and the next hour finding someone on the accounting team to blame for any perceived flaw in the universe. Bob finally took the stage. He didn't use a microphone at first. He didn't need one. His voice boomed naturally, filling the vast space. He was wearing a sharp, dark suit that probably cost more than Mark made in a year. He beamed a predatory smile, the kind that didn't reach his eyes. All right, people, welcome. Welcome to the review of Nelson Dynamics' best quarter yet. Bob clapped his hands once, a sharp, loud sound that made Mark jump. He spent the next 40 minutes doing exactly what everyone expected, chest thumping. He talked about new acquisitions, market dominance, and how he, Bob Nelson, was a visionary genius who saw opportunities where others saw only spreadsheets. Then the mood shifted. A massive projection screen behind Bob lit up, displaying a complex, ugly spreadsheet filled with green and, ominously, several glaring red figures. Now, Bob said, his voice dropping slightly, laced with mock disappointment, we get to the necessary evil, the housekeeping. He strode over to the screen and pointed a laser at a line item labeled unaccounted capital transfers. The number next to it was huge. Not thousands, millions. Several $1 million precisely that seemed to have vanished into the ether during the transition between the old quarter and the new. Look at this, Bob sneered, turning his gaze directly toward the accounting section. Just look at this mess. This is what happens, folks, when we rely on human beings who are supposed to be professional, to handle simple math. He paced the stage, working the room like a stand-up comedian, only the joke was always at someone else's expense. We're talking about $6.2 million. $6.2 million missing. Not invested, not spent, not even properly categorized, just gone. He threw his hands up dramatically. And when I ask my team, my highly paid team, where the money went, what do I get? Shrugs, fumbling, excuses about transitional errors and system reconciliation failures. He stopped, his eyes sweeping over the accounting section until they landed on a middle-aged manager named Susan, who was already pale and gripping the armrests of her chair. Susan, dear, Bob's voice was dripping with false sweetness. "Tell me again, what brilliant excuse did you offer for this failure? Did the dog eat the general ledger? Did the calculator run out of batteries?" Susan stammered. "Mr. Nelson, we are still cross-referencing the internal routing numbers. The transfers appear to have been diverted through several non-standard holding accounts before the final closing date. It's complex, but we believe we can track the final destination within the week." Bob let out a loud, booming laugh that echoed off the high ceiling. It wasn't a friendly laugh. It was a weapon.
A week? Susan, this isn't rocket science. It's basic addition and subtraction. I could hire a high school intern to do this job for minimum wage and get better results. In fact, maybe I should. Because this, he gestured widely at the spreadsheet, this demonstrates a fundamental lack of competence. You people are replaceable, every single one of you, and I hope you remember that when you clock out today.
Mark felt a cold wave wash over him. And if you're feeling that tension right now, drop a comment below telling me if you've ever had a boss like Bob Nelson. I read every single one. He hated these meetings. He hated the feeling that his entire professional worth could be destroyed by a single stray comment from this powerful man. He lowered his gaze, focusing intently on the shared conference table positioned right below the stage. That table was meant for the board members, though only a few were present today. On the mahogany surface sat a thick, pristine leather folder. It was labeled Q2 Board Reconciliation and Compliance Review. This folder was the holy grail of documents, the master set. It contained every report, every summary, and every deep dive analysis that the executives were supposed to review before the meeting. It was a shared resource, passed around for reference. Mark, still trying to disappear, nervously picked up his own copy of the presentation documents from a stack placed at his seat. He needed something to focus on besides Bob's rant. He started comparing the projected numbers to the printed summary in his hand. Bob, meanwhile, was still tearing into the team, using the missing $6 million as proof that the entire department was useless.
"You know what the problem is," Bob continued, lowering his voice conspiratorially to the room. "These guys, they don't see the big picture. They just see numbers. They forget that this is my money, my reputation, my company. And when you lose $6 million, that's not a mistake. That's negligence." As Bob spoke, Mark's eyes drifted from his own summary page to the folder on the main table. Bob, in his rush to prepare the materials for the board, had clearly forgotten to remove a critical piece of evidence. Tucked inside the shared board folder was a complete, unredacted reconciliation report, a document that Mark knew usually stayed locked away in the auditor's office. Mark's heart started hammering against his ribs, because the reconciliation report contained the internal routing numbers that Susan had mentioned, the non-standard holding accounts. Mark, driven by morbid curiosity and the need to find something to distract himself, leaned forward slightly. He could see the top page of that detailed report lying open in the shared folder. His eyes, trained for detail, scanned the columns. He was looking for the unusual transfer codes, and there they were, listed plainly, 3 separate transfers, totaling $6,200,000, all routed out of Nelson Dynamics' main operating fund. He followed the destination column. The names were usually acronyms for banks or investment trusts, but this one was different. It listed a specific account number, and next to it, the holding entity, the Nelson Private Equity Trust. Mark blinked once, then twice, rapidly checking the account number against a known database he had access to on his phone, a database of internal company accounts used for auditing purposes. His world stopped spinning.
The account number for the Nelson Private Equity Trust was a known entity within the company's upper finance structure. It was an account strictly used for highly personal investments, property purchases, and major tax planning for one individual. That individual, of course, was Bob Nelson. The missing $6.2 million didn't vanish due to incompetence. It didn't vanish due to a transitional error. It had been deliberately transferred from the company's books into Bob Nelson's personal holding account. Mark sat frozen. The truth, cold and sharp, had landed right in his lap. And folks, this is where the story gets absolutely wild. If you're not subscribed yet, hit that button now, because what happens next is the kind of justice we all dream about. His boss, the man currently standing 20 feet away, mocking his team and threatening their jobs, was a thief. He hadn't just made a mistake,
He had embezzled the funds and was now using the meeting to publicly blame the very people whose meticulous work had uncovered his crime. Mark felt the blood drain from his face. He wanted to shout. He wanted to stand up and point at the folder and expose the whole thing. But the words caught in his throat like shards of ice. Bob Nelson was a monster of industry. Challenging him in this room, in front of the board, in front of everyone, felt like professional suicide, maybe even worse. Bob would crush him, he would laugh him out of the building, and Mark would never work in this town again. He gripped his pen tighter, trembling. He looked around wildly. Did anyone else see it? The board members were mostly looking at the screen, listening to Bob rail about accountability. No one was looking closely at the shared folder. It was just another piece of paper to them.
Mark swallowed hard, his breathing shallow. He knew. He had the evidence. But his fear was a physical weight, pressing him into the chair. He was Mark, the nervous junior accountant. He couldn't do this. He couldn't be the hero. He was invisible, and he needed to stay that way. He slid back slightly, trying to make himself smaller. He needed someone else to see it, someone brave, someone who didn't fear Bob Nelson's wrath. But who? Everyone in the room feared Bob Nelson. Bob was reaching the crescendo of his rant. So, I want action, not excuses. I want that $6 million found, and I want the people responsible for this abysmal display of failure to understand that their tenure here is hanging by a thread. I'm tired of babysitting people who can't count to 10. He paused, pulling a tissue from his pocket to wipe his brow dramatically. The room was silent again, the tension unbearable. Now, Bob said, his voice returning to a sharp command. Marta, where is Marta? Let's get these finalized reports distributed to the managers and the auditors so they can see exactly what kind of failure we are dealing with here. Marta. The name hung in the air. Marta was Bob's executive assistant, his secretary. She was an absolute whirlwind of efficiency, the quiet engine that kept Bob Nelson running. She was middle-aged, sharp, always impeccably dressed, and completely unflappable. She had worked for Bob for 15 years, enduring his temper and his arrogance with a professional detachment that bordered on sainthood. Mark watched as Marta emerged from a side door, pushing a cart stacked high with neat piles of printed reports. She was the one who made sure everyone had the right copy of the right document. She was the silent facilitator, the person who made sure the machinery of the meeting worked. She approached the main conference table first, ready to distribute the board copies. Mark watched her move. She paused by the shared leather folder, the one containing the exposed truth. She reached out, her hand hovering over the stack of paper, preparing to hand the documents out to the managers seated nearby. This was it. Marta was about to touch the evidence. Mark's heart was pounding so hard he thought the people next to him might hear it. He still couldn't speak, but he watched Marta with desperate intensity, hoping she would see what he saw, hoping she would catch the damning detail. Marta, completely focused on her task, picked up the folder. She started to pull out the first stack of summaries, ready to pass them down the table. As she did so, the top page of the unredacted reconciliation report, the one listing the Nelson Private Equity Trust and the missing millions, slipped slightly, catching her eye for a fraction of a second. She stopped. Her movement, which had been fluid and efficient, ceased entirely. Bob Nelson, still standing center stage, had just started talking about his next venture, already moving on from the humiliation of the accounting team. And once we clear up this pathetic little mess, we can focus on the future. We're looking at a major expansion in the Dallas market. Marta didn't look up at Bob. She didn't look at Mark, or the board members. She looked down at the document in her hands, her expression unreadable. She had been copying and filing Bob's financial life for 15 years. She knew his handwriting, his spending habits, and every single one of his private accounts. She saw the account number. She saw the amount. She saw Bob Nelson's name tied directly to the missing $6.2 million. Bob's voice droned on about Dallas. Marta slowly straightened up, holding the stack of papers against her chest. She didn't raise her voice, but the sudden stillness of her movement drew the attention of the managers closest to the table. Then she spoke. Her voice, usually soft and professional, cut through the auditorium, clear and steady, like a small, sharp bell. Before I tell you what she said, make sure you've hit that subscribe button and turned on notifications, because this moment right here, this is peak corporate justice. Mr. Nelson, Marta said. Bob stopped mid-sentence. He was not used to being interrupted, especially not by his secretary. He turned, frowning slightly. Yes, Marta, what is it? Just hand out the reports, please. Marta didn't move. She held his gaze, and for the first time in 15 years, her professional mask slipped just enough to show something hard and cold underneath. Sir, she repeated, I apologize for the interruption, but I believe I may have located the missing funds. A hush fell over the auditorium, heavier than the previous tension. Bob, annoyed by the delay, just scoffed. Oh, really, Marta? Did you find $6 million tucked behind the printer? Let the professional accountants handle this, please. Marta took a small step forward, making sure the document was clearly visible. No, sir. According to the reconciliation report for the board, which you left in the shared folder, she emphasized the word you just enough to make it stick. The $6.2 million missing from the operating capital was routed via 3 internal transfers on the 28th of last month. She paused, letting the numbers sink in, before delivering the final, devastating blow. Those transfers match the exact amount and date of a deposit made into the holding account for your personal entity, the Nelson Private Equity Trust. It appears the missing millions were transferred directly into your private funds, Mr. Nelson. The sound of Bob Nelson's voice stopped completely. It was as if someone had yanked the plug on the power source.
The vast auditorium was now so quiet you could hear the hum of the overhead lights. Chairs that had been shifting stopped moving. Pens that had been tapping froze mid-air. Every single manager, every auditor, every nervous junior accountant, including Mark, who was now breathing again, albeit shallowly, stared at the stage. Bob Nelson, the man who lived to humiliate others, the man who believed himself untouchable, stood utterly silent, looking at his secretary. He didn't blink. His face, usually so animated by arrogance and mockery, was now completely blank. No one spoke. No one defended him. The entire room was waiting to see what the great Bob Nelson would do now that his quiet, efficient secretary had exposed him as a common thief. Bob Nelson stood motionless. If you had told anyone in that room 5 minutes earlier that the man who owned half the state would be silenced by a piece of paper held by his secretary, they would have laughed you out of the building. But there he was, the great titan of industry, caught like a kid with his hand in the cookie jar. The silence lasted maybe 5 seconds, but it felt like the entire quarter, maybe the entire year, grinding to a halt. Then, the steam began to rise off Bob. His eyes narrowed, not in anger yet, but in pure, lethal disbelief. He looked at Marta as if she had suddenly grown a second head right there on the stage. Marta, he finally hissed, and his voice was low, cold, and utterly devoid of his usual bombast. It was the sound of a predator realizing it had been wounded. What did you just say? Marta didn't flinch. She had been taking this man's calls, scheduling his life, and covering his tracks for 15 years. She knew exactly how dangerous he was, but she also knew the power of a documented truth. She held the folder firmly.
Mr. Nelson, she repeated, her voice still professional, still measured. The reconciliation report clearly shows the internal transfer of $6.2 million from the company's operating accounts directly into the Nelson Private Equity Trust, your personal holding entity. The dates align perfectly with the funds you claimed were missing and blamed the accounting team for. Bob's face went from white to a dangerous mottled red. He took a step toward the table, his hands flexing into fists. He wasn't thinking about the board or the auditors anymore. He was thinking about silencing the messenger. "You are out of line, Marta," he roared, finally breaking the silence with an explosion that rattled the projection screen. You are a secretary. You do not interpret financial documents, you distribute them. You have absolutely no business making baseless accusations in a formal setting. He pointed a shaking finger at her. You are confused, you are mistaken, and you are about to be fired for gross insubordination and slander. Hand me that document immediately. Marta held her ground. Her composure was the only thing keeping the room from descending into a panic. I am not mistaken, sir, she said calmly. I prepared the final board copy. I know the routing numbers. She gently placed the full folder back on the table, not handing it to Bob, but positioning it so the page was visible to the board members seated directly across from her. The document is available for immediate verification by the auditing team, she finished, stepping back slightly, her duty done. Now this was the critical moment. Bob was charging the table, clearly intending to snatch the document and rip it to shreds, but he wasn't the only powerful force in the room.
The auditors were there, flown in from Chicago, and they reported to the SEC and the board of directors, not directly to Bob. They had been stewing over the missing $6.2 million for 3 days, listening to Bob mock their competence. A large, serious man named Mr. Henderson, the lead external auditor, a man who looked like he hadn't smiled since 1987, pushed his chair back with a loud scrape. He was seated right next to the folder. Henderson reached out and placed a heavy hand directly on the leather folder before Bob could get within 10 feet of it. "Hold it right there, Mr. Nelson," Henderson commanded. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of regulatory power. "This document is now evidence, and based on Miss Marta's statement, we are taking immediate custody of it." Bob stopped dead in his tracks. He knew he could fire Marta instantly. He knew he could terrorize his managers. But he could not physically assault a lead auditor who was now actively holding the evidence. That was a line even Bob Nelson, in his magnificent hubris, knew not to cross. "Custody?" Bob sputtered, trying to regain control. "This is ridiculous. This is an internal misunderstanding, a clerical error. Henderson, you are overreacting based on a mistake made by an administrative assistant." Henderson ignored Bob completely. He signaled to his 2 junior auditors, who immediately sprang into action. One pulled out a small professional camera and snapped several high-resolution photos of the exposed page right there on the table. The other auditor, a young woman with a sharp gaze, carefully picked up the folder and sealed it inside a clear plastic evidence bag, marking the time and date. The formality of the evidence bagging was like a slap in Bob's face. It wasn't a mistake anymore. It was a crime scene. Mark, the nervous junior accountant in the back, felt a surge of cold validation mixed with sheer terror. He was watching the methodical process confirm the truth he had discovered just minutes earlier. He saw the auditor photograph the account number he had memorized. He saw Marta stand tall, the calm eye of the storm. Mark realized that Marta wasn't just loyal, she was righteous. She hadn't done it for revenge. She had done it because Bob was about to destroy the careers of the accounting team, blaming them for his own deliberate theft. She had protected the pencil pushers. Meanwhile, the board members were exchanging horrified glances. These were successful people, but they were not used to raw, exposed corporate malfeasance happening live in front of them. One man, the chairman of the audit committee, a distinguished gentleman named Mr. Sterling, finally cleared his throat. "Mr. Nelson," Sterling said, his voice grave, "if these allegations are even remotely true, this is a profound violation of trust and fiduciary duty. We cannot simply dismiss this as a clerical error. Mr. Henderson, please confirm the details from the document immediately." Henderson, holding the now sealed bag, nodded. He pulled out his laptop, accessed his internal audit software, and started cross-referencing the account number listed in the physical document with the bank records the auditors already possessed. The silence returned, but this time it was expectant. It was the sound of a courtroom waiting for the jury's verdict. Bob Nelson, realizing he was losing the room, tried one last desperate maneuver to distract everyone. He turned his rage back toward the accounting team, attempting to revert to his favorite script. "This is a setup," Bob yelled, gesturing wildly at the pale accountants in the front row. "They put this document there. They are trying to sabotage me because I exposed their incompetence. Look at them. They're all in on it." He was trying to make the accounting team the villain again, but the accusation fell flat. Everyone had just seen Marta, his trusted secretary, expose him. The accounting team looked less like conspirators and more like survivors of a plane crash. Mark kept his head down, praying Bob wouldn't specifically call him out. He knew he had seen the report first, but Marta had the courage to speak. Then Mr. Henderson looked up from his laptop. His face was grim. "Chairman Sterling," Henderson announced, his voice carrying clearly across the auditorium. "The routing numbers and the account number listed in the reconciliation report for the $6.2 million transfer are confirmed. They match the routing information for the Nelson Private Equity Trust. Furthermore, our internal database confirms that the funds left the Nelson Dynamics accounts on the morning of the 28th and were deposited into the personal trust account later that afternoon." He closed his laptop with a definitive snap. "This is not a clerical error, Mr. Nelson," Henderson stated, looking directly at the CEO. "This is a direct transfer of corporate funds for personal benefit." The air in the auditorium seemed to rush out all at once. If you're loving this story as much as I loved telling it, share this video with someone who needs to see what happens when arrogance meets accountability. Seriously, they'll thank you for it. There was a collective intake of breath from the managers and the staff. The word embezzlement hung unspoken in the air. Bob Nelson's imposing frame seemed to shrink. The color drained completely from his face, leaving him looking sickly and old. All his power, his bluster, his carefully constructed reputation as the self-made genius had just dissolved into the reality of a simple, fraudulent transfer. He opened his mouth, perhaps to deny it again, perhaps to threaten legal action, but no sound came out. He looked around the room, searching for a friendly face, a defender, someone who would side with the money and the power. He found none. The board members, who had benefited from his successes but were legally bound to the company's integrity, looked away in disgust. The auditors looked at him with professional condemnation. The junior staff looked at him with a mixture of fear and astonished triumph. And the accounting team? They just sat there, silent, victorious, without having lifted a finger or spoken a word. Susan, Bob had mocked relentlessly, simply lowered her head, not in defeat, but in quiet, profound relief. They were vindicated. Bob Nelson had nothing left. He had spent years building his image on the foundation of his own genius and the incompetence of others. Now, that foundation was gone. He stumbled backward slightly, bumping into the large projection screen behind him, which still displayed the ugly red number, $6,200,000. Unaccounted capital transfers. Chairman Sterling stood up, signaling the end of the line. "The quarterly results meeting is immediately adjourned," Sterling declared, his voice firm and decisive. "Mr. Nelson, you are to remain here with the board and the external counsel, who are already en route. The rest of the staff is dismissed. You will receive further instruction via email." Dismissed. It was the ultimate irony. Bob Nelson usually dismissed his employees with a scornful wave of his hand. Now, he was being dismissed from his own meeting, from his own company, by his own board. The managers and staff rose slowly, almost hesitantly, unsure if they should flee or stay and watch the inevitable implosion. They moved like ghosts, gathering their papers, avoiding eye contact with the man on the stage. Mark, the nervous junior accountant, finally stood up. His legs felt wobbly. He looked at Marta, who was now quietly collecting the extra presentation copies from the table, her expression serene once more, her professionalism restored. She had done the right thing, and she was now moving on to the next task, as if exposing a massive corporate fraud was just part of the Tuesday agenda. Mark wanted to thank her. He wanted to tell her he saw it too. But he was still Mark, the quiet one. He simply gave her the slightest, almost imperceptible nod from across the room. Marta caught his eye. She didn't smile, but she gave him a small knowing nod in return. It was a shared secret, a silent pact between the two invisible people who had witnessed the truth. As Mark hurried toward the exit, blending into the stream of relieved and shocked employees, he heard Bob Nelson's voice one last time, strained and desperate, arguing with Chairman Sterling about lawyers and rights. The booming arrogance was gone,
replaced by the pathetic whimper of a man who had lost everything because he couldn't resist mocking the quiet people who actually kept track of the numbers. The doors swung shut behind Mark, muffling the sound of the CEO's desperate negotiations. The meeting had ended, but it hadn't ended with a formal declaration of termination for the accounting team. It had ended with the swift, brutal removal of Bob Nelson. The accounting team was not mocked again, not that day and not ever after. Their meticulous, quiet work had saved them, and the hero, it turned out, was the one person Bob Nelson had completely underestimated: his secretary, Marta.
The story, however, doesn't stop just because the meeting adjourned. What happened next? The fallout, the legal battles, and the quiet revolution that took place within Nelson Dynamics? Well, that's where the real cleaning up begins. And trust me, when you steal $6.2 million from a company you founded, the cleanup is messy and the consequences are brutal. The quiet storm had passed, and now came the reckoning. And if you want to know exactly what happened to Bob Nelson and how his company rebuilt itself, keep watching. And don't forget to like this video if you're Team Marta. She's the real hero here. The doors of the auditorium swung shut, but the silence didn't last. Outside those walls, the world of Nelson Dynamics was already tilting on its axis. When Mark, the junior accountant, stepped back into the sterile fluorescent light of the hallway, he wasn't just walking away from a meeting. He was walking out of a history book. He and the rest of the staff moved in a daze, clutching their useless presentation documents, the air thick with whispered shock. Nobody went back to work immediately. They huddled by the water cooler, checking their phones. In the auditorium, the reckoning was swift. You have to understand corporate power. Bob Nelson was a titan, yes, but he was a titan built on a legal structure. Once Mr. Henderson, the auditor, confirmed the evidence, Bob's control evaporated faster than spilled coffee on a hot sidewalk. The external counsel arrived within the hour. They didn't even let Bob return to his corner office on the 50th floor. A security detail, which usually protected Bob from the outside world, was now politely but firmly ensuring he didn't leave the premises without supervision.
The news broke like a dam. By the time Mark got home that evening and turned on the local news, Bob Nelson was already the lead story. The self-made genius exposed as a common embezzler who stole $6.2 million from his own company to fund his private trust. The narrative wrote itself: arrogance, hubris, and the fall of a man who thought he was too smart to be caught by the pencil pushers. Bob Nelson was gone by midnight. Not just fired, but legally separated, pending investigation and inevitable lawsuits. The board moved with terrifying speed, installing Mr. Sterling, the audit committee chairman, as the interim CEO. The next morning, the office felt different. The air was breathable again. The cloud of fear that Bob had generated for years had lifted. Everyone still worked hard, but they worked with a sense of purpose, not terror. And what about the accounting team? Well, they were gods now. They didn't boast, they didn't gloat. They simply came in, sat at their desks, and started the meticulous, painful process of undoing Bob's mess. Every single transaction, every internal transfer, every account Bob had touched had to be scrutinized. They were the only ones who knew how to find the rest of the missing pieces. Susan, the manager Bob had verbally shredded the day before, walked into the office with her head held high. She wasn't pale anymore. She was respected. She was essential. That week, the new interim CEO, Mr. Sterling, held a company-wide meeting, not in the cavernous auditorium, but in a functional conference room. He spoke plainly, without the booming ego of Bob Nelson. "We have undergone a serious crisis of integrity," Sterling said, "but I want to be perfectly clear about one thing. The integrity of this company was maintained, not by the flashy, high-level executives, but by the professionals whose diligence and precision uncovered this breach."
He didn't name the team, but everyone knew who he meant. He then announced an immediate company-wide restructuring of the finance department. The accounting team was given a massive increase in authority, a significant budget boost for new software, and, most importantly, a direct, unfiltered line of communication to the board of directors. Their work, once mocked as basic addition and subtraction, was now recognized as the critical bedrock of the entire enterprise. The pencil pushers had become the sentinels. Mark, sitting in the back, felt a quiet pride warm his chest. He wasn't afraid of the numbers anymore. He understood that the numbers, when handled honestly, were the ultimate shield.
And Marta, Marta. She was the true hero who had stood up and spoken the truth when everyone else was paralyzed by fear. Marta didn't ask for a new title, but she got one anyway. She was immediately promoted to Executive Director of Corporate Compliance, a role that gave her oversight of all internal reporting procedures and a generous salary bump that finally reflected her true value to the company. Mark watched her interact with the new management. She was still calm, still impeccable, but now she moved with undeniable authority. She wasn't just handing out reports, she was setting policy. A few days after the dust settled, Mark was called into Susan's office. He was nervous, but not cripplingly so. Susan looked at him kindly. "Mark," she said, "you're meticulous. You were looking at the reconciliation report before anyone else. You saw it first, didn't you?" Mark nodded, his throat tight. "Yes, ma'am. I checked the account number." Susan smiled, a genuine, relieved smile. "I knew it. You are the quiet eyes of this department. You didn't speak up, and I understand why. Bob Nelson specialized in making good people feel small. But you knew the truth, and you held on to it. And you know what? Marta saw you too." Mark looked up, surprised. "She did."
She did, Susan confirmed. "She said she saw you staring intently at that folder right before she picked it up. She knew someone was on the verge of cracking the code, and she had the means to confirm it immediately." Susan slid a thick file across the desk. "We are short-staffed now, and frankly, we need people we can trust absolutely. I need someone to lead the forensics audit on Bob's personal expenses. Everything he ran through the company over the last 5 years. It's tedious, deep dive work. It requires absolute focus and discretion. It requires your kind of meticulousness." Mark looked at the file. It was daunting. It was also the most important, high-level project he had ever been offered. "I can do it, Susan," Mark said, and the words came out clear, without the usual tremor of fear. "I know you can," she replied. Mark walked out of that office with the promotion and a hefty raise, but more importantly, he walked out with a sense of purpose. If this story is resonating with you, let me know in the comments what you would have done in Mark's position. Would you have spoken up, or would you have stayed quiet like he did? His obedience hadn't been to fear, it had been to the numbers, and the numbers had rewarded him. He never became the loud, charismatic executive. Mark remained Mark, quiet, meticulous, glasses perpetually slipping. But now, when he walked through the hallways of Nelson Dynamics, people didn't overlook him. They looked at him with respect, because they knew he was one of the people who kept the ship afloat. Bob Nelson, meanwhile, became a cautionary tale. He faced criminal charges, massive civil lawsuits, and the complete destruction of his reputation. His self-made empire collapsed under the weight of his own ego. He lost the money, he lost the company, and worst of all for a man like him, he lost the stage. He was no longer the star, he was the villain, and his audience was gone. The final irony came 6 months later, during the annual company holiday party. Mark was standing near the edge of the crowd, talking, quietly of course, to a colleague about the new quarterly budget projections. Marta walked past, heading toward the new interim CEO, Mr. Sterling. She paused when she reached Mark. "Mark," she said, her tone warm and professional, "how is the forensic audit progressing?" "On track, Miss Marta," Mark replied, using her formal title, which she now commanded. "We've recovered another $300,000 in fraudulent expense reports just this week." Marta nodded approvingly. "Excellent work. Keep watching the details, Mark. They are everything." She moved on, leaving Mark feeling energized. He looked around the room. The atmosphere was light, genuinely celebratory. People were laughing, not nervously, but happily. There were no booming voices, no threats, no humiliation. The culture of fear was dead. The story of the missing millions, the mocking millionaire, and the secretary who spoke up became the new foundation of Nelson Dynamics. It wasn't about being the loudest or the most aggressive. It was about being right. It was about the quiet, detailed, essential work that Bob Nelson had so carelessly dismissed. Mark raised his glass slightly toward Marta, who was now engaged in a serious conversation with the CEO. He then raised it toward Susan, who was celebrating with the rest of the accounting team, a team that was now untouchable, indispensable, and finally, respected. He realized then that the true power in any organization isn't held by the loudest voice in the room, but by the quiet ones who actually know where the money is. And sometimes,
All it takes is one moment of courage, delivered by the most unassuming person, to bring down the biggest bully. And the accounting team? They just kept counting, and nobody ever dared to call them pencil pushers again.
That, my friends, is the end of the story. A testament to the power of a quiet truth. If you enjoyed this tale of corporate karma and justice, do me a favor. Hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and check out the next video I've got queued up for you. It's another story you won't want to miss. Thanks for watching, and remember, sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one holding all the power.